Good afternoon. Welcome to the committee's oversight hearing on select provisions of the 1866 Reconstruction Treaties between the United States and Oklahoma tribes. In the 1830s, the U.S. forcibly removed the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole nations from their ancestral homelands in the southeast to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears. At the same time, individual members of the five tribes enslaved black people, continuing to do so through the Civil War. In 1866, the five tribes signed treaties with the United States which further reduced their land holdings and contained provisions about emancipation of enslaved peoples who are collectively referred to as the freedmen. Now, for the first time in the history of the United States Senate, these sovereign signatory tribes, freedmen descendants, and the administration have an opportunity to present their views on the 1866 treaties for the record. I understand and acknowledge that this is a difficult conversation because this issue at its core involves injustices perpetrated by the United States government more than a century ago against both Native Americans and African Americans. It is emotionally charged for many and for good reason. Years-long litigation and disagreement over citizenship status of freedmen descendants among the five treaty tribes has divided communities and even divided individual families. But disagreements cannot get resolved in silence, and so we will soon be hearing from tribal leaders and representatives for each of the five tribes who will speak to their nation's treaty provisions with respect to freedmen descendants. Representative Waters, who has fought for freedmen descendants' rights for years, particularly in her leadership of the House Financial Services Committee, as well as Marilyn Vann, whose advocacy through her organization has raised awareness for freedmen descendants of all five tribes. And later this afternoon, I look forward to a deeper dialogue with individual leaders of freedmen groups. So it is our goal today to start a respectful dialogue, to listen to different perspectives, both in a formal setting and informally among members of Congress, tribal leaders, and freedmen advocates, and to educate the committee and the public with informed accounts relating to our nation's two greatest failures: the removal of Native peoples from their traditional homelands and the enslavement of Black people. Descendants of both, many here today, still carry the pain of those grave injustices. I look forward to a respectful conversation that takes into account the historic importance of this hearing. I'll now recognize Vice Chair Murkowski for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening today's very, very important and, as you have noted, a historic hearing. I apologize that I'm not there in person, but COVID is keeping me here in Alaska for this week. The history of the post-Civil War Reconstruction Treaty tribes, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole nations, often referred to as the five tribes, and the freedmen, the lineal descendants of African American slaves owned by the five tribes, is part of history that perhaps many Americans are not familiar with, nor do they fully understand. It is a complicated history of injustice and of sorrow for both Indian tribes and African Americans. And as you have noted, Mr. Chairman, this can be an uncomfortable discussion. It can be uncomfortable to talk about what was brought on by the federal government's own policies of forced removal of Native peoples from their ancestral homelands and the enslavement of African peoples. I understand that each of the five tribes has a very unique history with freedmen based on separate treaties with the United States, so I am interested in learning more about what these treaties entail and the obligations of both the tribes and the federal government to freedmen descendants. So I do want to say how appreciative I am that the Indian Affairs Committee is examining this history, and that the five tribes and the freedmen descendants are here, along with the Department of Interior, to have a constructive and again, a respectful dialogue about how we might move forward together. This is indeed long, long overdue. I agree with the chairman that we should task the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, with investigating what federal services the freedmen receive and should receive in the future from the federal government. And with that, I turn back to you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you for convening this very important and very substantive hearing. And for the many witnesses that are there in person today, thank you for traveling to be before the committee on a very important topic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair Murkowski, and we wish you a speedy recovery and look forward to seeing you soon. Are there other members of the committee wishing to make an opening statement? If not, we'll turn to our first witness, who is a towering figure in history enough so that she comprises her own panel. We are pleased to introduce the Honorable Maxine Waters, U.S. Representative for the 43rd Congressional District in California. Congresswoman, your full written testimony will be made part of the official hearing record, and we look forward to your remarks. Please proceed with your testimony.
Thank you very much, Chairman Schultz. Vice Chair Murkowski and members of the committee. Today I'm here to discuss an issue I care very deeply about, but has been ignored for far too long. Many remain unfamiliar with the history of those who came to be known as the Native American freedmen and the ongoing plight of their descendants. The freedmen were Black individuals who were enslaved by 5 formerly slave-holding tribal nations and were forced to walk and suffer on the Trail of Tears alongside their slave masters. A year after the Civil War ended, the 5 tribes agreed to abolish slavery and accept freedmen and their descendants as full tribal citizens under the 1866 treaty agreements they made with the United States government. Specifically, the 1866 treaties required the 5 tribes to abolish slavery and to agree to treat and accept formerly enslaved individuals and their lineal descendants as equal tribal citizens. For example, the treaty signed by the Cherokee Nation reads, and I quote, "All native-born Cherokee, all Indians and whites legally members of the nation by adoption, and all freemen who have been liberated by voluntary act of their former owners or by law, as well as free colored persons who were in the country at the commencement of the rebellion and are now residents therein, or who may return within 6 months from the 19th day of July, 1866, and their descendants who reside within the limits of the Cherokee Nation shall be taken and deemed to be citizens of the Cherokee Nation," quote unquote. The 4 other tribes all signed similar treaties. Despite the fact that these treaty obligations still exist and are binding on the 5 tribes beginning in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the tribes began to take formal actions to take away the citizenship rights of descendants of freedmen. For instance, in 1983, freedmen were prohibited from voting in Cherokee Nation elections and received letters informing them that their citizenship had been canceled. In 2007, the Cherokee amended their constitution to limit citizenship to only individuals who were, quote, Cherokee by blood, unquote. These actions led to years of litigation that was finally settled in 2017 when a federal district court judge ruled in favor of the freedmen and their right to citizenship. In this ruling, the judge stated, and I quote, "In accordance with Article 9 of the 1866 treaty, the Cherokee freedmen have a present right to citizenship in the Cherokee Nation that is coexistent with the rights of Native Cherokees, quote unquote. Following the court decision, which the Cherokee Nation accepted as binding, the tribe has taken actions to comply with the decision and ensure that descendants of freedmen are treated as equal citizens. Before my committee, Cherokee Nation Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin testified that these actions have made the Cherokee Nation, quote, a better nation for having recognized full and equal citizenship of freedmen descendants. Despite the actions of the Cherokee to right the wrong inflicted on its freedmen, the descendants of freedmen of the other 4 tribes continue to be denied tribal citizenship and other basic rights associated with citizenship, like equal access to federally funded affordable housing. My committee even heard testimony last year that freedmen have even been denied access to life-saving vaccines during the ongoing pandemic. It was this testimony that prompted even the Biden administration to designate all Seminole freedmen as eligible for healthcare services, including the COVID vaccine, through the Indian Health Service. However, this only decision only applies to Seminole freedmen and not freedmen from the other tribes. We know that equal access to housing sits at the heart of many of the racial and economic injustices we continue to see across the country today. As chairwoman of the House Financial Services Committee, I recognize that Native communities face some of the worst housing conditions in the United States. It is also important to recognize that the legacy of land and cultural disenfranchisement has created and maintained these circumstances. That is why I propose providing $2 billion for affordable housing in tribal communities in my Housing is Infrastructure Act, and why I'm moving to reauthorize NAHASDA with language that ensures that descendants of freedmen have equal access to these resources, as the 1866 treaties promised. When Barney Frank, my predecessor, was chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, he recognized the plight of the freedmen and was a staunch advocate for their rights. I worked closely with him on legislation to prevent tribes from disenfranchising their descendants. As ranking member and now chairwoman of the committee, I continue that fight for justice for the descendants of freedmen. Currently, there are tribes that are implementing federally funded programs in a way that actively discriminates against descendants of freedmen in direct violation of treaty obligations. Congress has every right to ensure that federal funding implemented in compliance with all relevant obligations. We must stand by the rights promised to freedmen and the treaties that guaranteed those rights over a century ago and hold these tribes accountable. I'd like to say how proud I am of the descendants of Native freedmen who have never wavered in their fight for human dignity and equal recognition, even when it seemed no one would listen, even with the growing movement for reparations that recognizes the forced and uncompensated labor that built this country and the riches amassed because of it. It seems that the fight of the descendants of freedmen still has never been rightfully acknowledged and affirmed. This pandemic has made clear that the ongoing discrimination of the freedmen descendants can literally mean the difference between life and death for descendants of freedmen who have been denied COVID vaccines. So I urge the distinguished members of this committee, we must honor our word as a nation and uphold, as honorable people, the obligations of these treaties. This is as much true for the United States government, which has failed to meet all of its treaty obligations, as it is for the 5 tribes. This work is ongoing, and it is the obligation to the descendants of freedmen that can't be left out of that conversation. I want to thank again Senator Schatz for holding this important hearing and working with me on this issue. And I must indicate that even though there appears to be only one representative here for the freedmen, I would like, if at all possible, to make sure that the voices of other freedmen are heard in some sense, in some way. And while I'm pleased that the United States Senate is finally hearing testimony from a freedman descendant, I must state that hearing from more voices, not less, is the key to productive dialogue. It is when we don't expand our table to hear more from those who have been disenfranchised that injustices and systemic inequities are perpetuated. So moving forward, I'm convinced that we can work together to not simply uplift the voices of freedmen, but also to recognize the shared suffering of Native freedmen and Native Americans forced to walk that trail of tears together, and the need to honor the treaties of 1866. I do not believe that the documented history of the descendants of freedmen can be ignored, forgotten, or dismissed any longer. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Waters. We appreciate your testimony. Members may submit follow-up questions for the record, and you are excused as we prepare our next panel.